This is TWiT.
So I ran across a nice summary breakdown of sort of a malware methodology by Sophos. I thought it was an appropriate way to ring in this new year to sort of quickly run through the lexicon of the terminology that we now use to describe the various sorts of enduring threats which continue to evolve and mature. They're the deadly seven. There are seven of them. Number one, keyloggers. They're surprisingly simple and can be implemented in many different ways. They hook into the stream of data coming from our keyboards, which allow them to capture everything we type. As anyone who has ever seen one of my squirrel presentations know, I often use the example of being in Las Vegas and needing to log into my Southwest Airlines account to get a boarding pass at a Las Vegas hotel's business center, and being horrified by the idea of entering my username and password into the widely shared PC there. And the reason I use it in a squirrel presentation is that Squirrel, of course, allows for it. It provides a zero keystroke login to untrusted PCs. Now, from the PC's standpoint and from the standpoint of any malware that is in it, I'm just suddenly logged in without doing anything. So there's no keystrokes for anybody to capture. And of course, the keyloggers, as a consequence of the way our keyboards work, keyboards actually transmit a key cap down, key cap up individual messages. So they don't merely know that we typed F. They get enough detail to tell that the user pressed the left shift key down, then pressed F, then released F, then let go of the shift key. So that means they can even keep track of keystrokes that don't produce any visible output, such as function keys, backspaces, and other key combinations that might be used to turn, alt and control things that turn options on and off. And of course, as we also know, they don't need to be implemented in software at the operating system level. They can be used without root power and hook themselves into the keystroke stream data up at the application level. Anyone who's installed a keystroke macro recorder and playback tool or an on-the-fly spell checker, I have one running on my system, will realize that the application sitting in the system tray down there is monitoring everything they are typing. So it's not rocket science. It turns out also JavaScript running in our browser can monitor and could alter, if it had some reason to, the text we're typing in, such as maybe delaying our own login, the flow of keystrokes as we browse. That means that rogue JavaScript injected into a login page could recognize and steal usernames and passwords. And let's recall that the integrity of our HTTPS connections is now being actively subverted by anything we allow to intercept and inspect our data, whether it's a corporate middle box or locally installed AV that is wanting to help us by doing this. I mean, those connections are no longer private. And of course, banking Trojans commonly include a keylogger module, so they can try to capture our passwords when they recognize that we're logging into a bank that they have been set up to recognize and subvert. And finally, as we know, keyloggers can be hardware. They can be a little device that you wouldn't even notice, a little lump in the cord connecting the physical keyboard to the back of the computer, a little what looks like an adapter at the back of the computer. In fact, I have some that are they are legitimate PS2 to USB adapters, but I'm sure that isn't a keystroke logger, but such things could look just like a legitimate adapter. And we've actually also seen instances where the keystroke logger is molded into the USB connector at the end of a keyboard. So it's a nefarious little bit of malware or maltech. Second, data stealers. That's the term given to sort of a generic group of malware that gets into our machine and then for their own purposes goes hunting around our hard drives, perhaps even around our whole network if they're able to escape the confines of our machine. And those data stealers look for specific types of data that is worth something to the crooks that launched it. Once upon a time, yes, those quaint vintage days of computing before the internet, we mostly had true computer viruses which spread by themselves, often infecting floppies in order to get from one machine to another. They would typically, when they got into a machine, spew out emails containing an infected attachment in order to spread themselves. Back then, many viruses would search through qualifying files on our computers looking for text strings that matched a specific pattern, such as an email address. And then by harvesting email addresses from everywhere they could find it, not only our own email clients' address books, they were able to send things out to people that we'd never even contacted, but whose addresses appeared in documents, marketing material, saved on web pages or whatever. You know, those days are long gone. Times have changed. But on the other hand, contemporary data stealers are much more sophisticated these days, and their interests are wide-ranging. Now they're searching out and looking for bank account details, ID numbers, passport data, credit cards, and account passwords. They know how to recognize special files by names and by internal structure. Sometimes if files are weakly encrypted, they're able to even to decrypt them in order to get into them. So that would give them access to poorly constructed password vaults that contain our credentials and browser databases, and may have authentication tokens and browser history. So several other classes of malware, such as bots and banking Trojans that we'll be talking about in a second, also include sophisticated data stealing modules in order to get the data that they care about. So these data stealers, are are in the lexicon because they are a class of malware. Then we have RAM scrapers, because malware can't always find what it wants in the files on our computer, even if the malware has admin or root access. That's because some useful data, you might even argue some of the most useful data, might only ever exist temporarily in RAM before it is deliberately scrubbed without ever being written to disk. Permanent storage of some data is now prohibited under regulation, such as the PCI-DSS, which is the payment card industry's data security standard, and the Europe's GDPR, their general data protection regulations. Those regulations prohibit the permanent storage of some information, such as the CVV number used to authorize credit card payments. And these regulations are naturally bad news for attackers, because it means they can't easily get hold of those codes and the transactions that have already occurred. However, with RAM scraping malware, which is able to keep an eye out for data as it is stored temporarily in memory, attackers may be able to spot what is critically useful data to them, such as CVV numbers and perhaps the accompanying full credit card information, and suck it right out of RAM, essentially scraping it. And as we know, computers must have, for a moment at least, a private key in RAM in workable decrypted state in order to perform decryption. So valuable secret data must transiently exist in RAM, even if only briefly. So things such as decryption keys, plain text passwords, website authentication tokens are being watched for by RAM scrapers. That's number 3 on our hit parade in the malware lexicon. Then we have number 4, bots. A bot, of course, is the term the industry has given to malware which sets up shop in a machine, then phones home to its bot master to report in. It requests and awaits for further instructions. And of course, it's not alone. It's typically in a large network. It essentially establishes a semi-permanent backdoor through a computer so that the bad guys can later send commands from wherever they are. And of course, as I said, we call a collection of such bots a botnet. The other popular term for bot is zombie, because they can also act like sleeper agents. The commands bots understand, including sending boatloads of spam from your IP address in order to avoid IP-based spam filters, searching for local files, sniffing for passwords, blasting other machines on the internet, or rather blasting them off the internet with floods of traffic, and even clicking on online ads to generate pay-per-click revenue span the range of what we have found bots doing. And of course, they're also capable of receiving updates to themselves to allow them to be updated and to download new and improved modules. So we've recently talked about the evolving strategies bots are using to sneak these updates into a network right under the noses of watchful AV screeners. And since bots are initiating connections outward to their bot masters, just like any IoT devices we've talked about, where you just set them up and, oh, look, they're magically connected. These things work the same way. They don't need ports open for them, and they're not, and our otherwise protective NAT routers don't protect us here, because outbound connections by default are allowed, whereas NAT routers, as we know, drop inbound connections. So number 4 in the malware lexicon was bots. Number 5, kind of related, but much more the specialist, are banking Trojans. And they are more prevalent than this podcast would have you believe. I guess I don't cover them much because they're not that exciting, but they're definitely in existence. They deserve their own subclass of malware because of their specialization. They exclusively target their victims' online banking information. And for what it's worth, I watch them grow in capability, where they're always adding more banks and lending institutions to their repertoire. As we might imagine, banking Trojans typically include a keylogger component, which is used to sniff out the passwords as the user is using them to log into the bank. They often incorporate a data stealer component to trawl through likely files such as browser databases and password vaults in the hopes of finding unencrypted passwords or account details. And a trick widely used by banking Trojans is web form injection. We haven't talked about this for years, but that occurs where the malware adds additional data fields to forms displayed in the browser. By doing this, they hope to trick their victims into entering additional unnecessary data, such as a credit card number for verification, unquote, or a date of birth. The typical computer user has, given up any hope of actually understanding what's going on when they use the computer. They just do what the computer tells them to. So they just hope for the best. So when their bank suddenly appears to be asking for a credit card number for some reason and or their date of birth, they think, well, okay, the bank knows those things, so it's okay, I guess. Well, in the process, they've just filled it into a form that the banking Trojan added and populated on their login form, and it collected information that it wanted that it wouldn't have otherwise been able to see them typing in because they weren't being asked. Anyway, banking Trojans are nefarious, and they're also a real big deal as number 5 in the malware lexicon. Second to last, at number 6, is RATS. I wish it had a more distinctive acronym, because it's never clear when I'm talking about a rat, like what I'm talking about. But it stands, of course, for Remote Access Trojan. It's got a lot in common with a bot, but it differs in that it's not usually part of a massive campaign simply to see how many bots can be corralled and managed for mass attack events. Instead, a rat enables much more targeted and potentially much more damaging intrusion. Normally, a rat is placed deliberately into a target machine, maybe through a social engineering, phishing attack, some other sort of intrusion. But here, it's not simply intending to use the machine as a point of attack, but rather looking inward rather than outward, seeing what's there, and essentially being a remote access Trojan, giving the person who is operating it, a persistent connection, able to sit there, look around, see what's going on. They're able to take screenshots, listen to the audio in our rooms by turning on our computer's microphone, and then, of course, turning on the webcams, which always makes people nervous about whether or not it's possible for the cam to be on while the little webcam light is off. And we do know that there are software systems that allow the light to be turned off even when the cam is continued to be on, which is why this podcast has long recommended using some sort of physical shutter, even if it's only a little corner of a Post-it note over the camera hole when you aren't deliberately sitting in front of it and having a conversation with someone. And finally, last but certainly not least, number 7 in the ransomware lexicon is ransomware. In the malware lexicon is ransomware. After 2019, it would likely be no exaggeration to state that ransomware is probably the most feared type of malware. Whereas many people might not know exactly what a bot or a rat are, pretty much everyone at this point has heard the horrifying stories of entire municipalities, companies, or healthcare providers being shut down by ransomware and then having to pay a lot of money in order to regain access. So your typical user may not know exactly what it is, but they know it's a current problem and it's one they don't want to have. As we've observed last year, the enabling factor for ransomware, and actually this is just my own theory, I don't think I've read it anywhere else. I think the enabling factor for ransomware was the rise of readily exchangeable cryptocurrency, because it used to be the way you caught the bad guys was you followed the money. Cryptocurrency makes that much, much more difficult. So until there was a safe and untraceable means for receiving payment, the ransomware business, such as it is, wasn't really able to take off. But today, there are even, as we know, companies specializing in being the go-between a ransomware victim and the extortionists who are demanding payment. So this has solved the problem of, I don't know how to send anyone Bitcoins. Now there are, helpful people that probably take a little piece of the action, but they know how to do that. Ransomware attacks can be so lucrative that they are the inverse of the scattershot bot model. Attackers can afford to sit inside a victim's network, take their time to maximize the damage done. After finding their way into the network, they can set up and get ready to scramble hundreds or even thousands of computers at the same time. And if they discover that online backups exist, those have the opportunity to be compromised. And what we've seen is, even if offline backups exist, if a large enterprise has done everything right, still the time and labor required to reimage and restore thousands of computers has been shown to be hugely damaging all by itself. No organization that is making responsible offline image backups expects to need to deploy all of them at once. They just figure, well, if a given machine suddenly explodes, we'll be able to get a replacement backup in no time. But much more difficult when ransomware takes all of the systems that it was able to find off and encrypts them at the same time. And because the payout might be significant, the attackers can afford to spend the time to research the entire cybersecurity countermeasure situation to sidestep or disable anything that might halt or limit the ransomware's reach and effect. It doesn't get a lot of attention, but the security forensics firms that are brought in often see effective defenses were in place and got sidestepped anyway. So it's just, that ransomware is the scourge of probably 2019 and promises no sign of letting up in 2020.